All right, folks, as you start to come in, go ahead and put your name and where you're from in the chat box. We got a few more who are being added at the moment. All right, so for those of you who haven't put your name and where you're from in the chat box, if you would go ahead and do that now. But I think we're going to go ahead and get things kicked off. My name's Brandon Hartman. I'm a livestock and forages agent in Rockingham County here in North Carolina. So we got 3 different speakers today, and today's sort of based around reproduction and planning around your reproductive decisions and all the way through selection of your replacements. So we're going to go ahead and post a quick poll for you to take that's just to sort of gauge your knowledge on the subjects we're speaking on today. So that's up now. So if you would go ahead and answer those 5 questions.
Can you all see the poll all right? Brandon, is it showing anyone participating on your end? There we go. I didn't know if it was just my computer having any issues.
We've now got 2, so we're getting there.
Looks like we're about 12 participants in the poll. If you don't mind answering that, that would be great. We got 80%. What do you think? Probably pretty good.
Yeah, I'd call that pretty good. Well, for those of y'all who did complete the poll, we appreciate you going through and completing that. So we're going to go ahead and get started with our first speaker for today. So as part of the winter webinar series, our first speaker today will be Dr. Andrew Weaver here at NC State. He is the small ruminant extension specialist, and he's going to talk about those the pre-breeding decisions. So Dr. Weaver, we're going to go ahead and turn it over to you.
You see my screen all right there?
Yes, sir.
Perfect. If anyone has any questions, feel free to type them in the chat, and then we'll, at the end, after everyone's done speaking, we'll address those questions if you want to unmute yourself and ask them at that time point. So to kick things off and to start off, pre-breeding, like to cover a few management topics, ideas, practices that you might want to think about as you prepare for the breeding season. And so to introduce all of that, why is reproduction so important? This is kind of where we need to start. And the first component, or that one of the components of this metric that's so important as it relates to the profitability of our small ruminant operations, is this pounds of animal, pounds of whether it be lambs or kids, whatever we're raising, pounds weaned per female exposed for breeding. And that all starts with conception rate. And so, obviously reproductive success, conception rate go hand in hand. And so by increasing conception rate, we're increasing the number of animals in our flock that get pregnant. Whether they get pregnant or not, we're still paying to feed them. And so if we're going to have them around our farm and we're going to pay to feed them, our goal would be to get them all pregnant. Obviously, they may not all get pregnant, but we would like the highest percentage possible. Of those that get pregnant, they're going to have a certain lambing or kidding percentage. And so this is the number born. And obviously animals that are more prolific are going to be more productive for us in general. But it's great that they're born, but they actually need to survive until weaning. And so not only does that ewe or that doe have to have those lambs or kids, but she needs to be able to keep them alive. She needs to be able to milk and keep those animals going so that we can actually wean them and then market them. Again, she can have 5 lambs born, but if she only weans one of them, we can only sell one. You can't sell dead lambs. So it's very important that she keeps them alive and we actually have a product that we can sell after we get them weaned. And then lamb weaning weight. Obviously, the larger lambs are going to contribute to a heavier litter weight, heavier weaning weight. And so if we can have more born and those individuals that are weaned, if they can each weigh more, we have more pounds of product being produced. But of all these metrics, that weaning percentage is the most important of them. And hopefully it's illustrated here. The orange bars represent individual weights within litters, and the blue bars represent our litter weights. And so let me see if I can get my pointer going here. There we go. So this shows weaning weight on the y-axis, birth and rear type on the x-axis. So the first number here you see is birth type. The second number you see is rear type. So these would be lambs that are born singles, reared singles. These would be lambs born triplets, reared as triplets. And what you'll see and what you would expect, as we get to these larger litter sizes, if you look at the orange bars, those individual weights going to decrease in those larger litters. They have to share resources. They're not going to be as heavy at weaning. But what you should notice is the blue bars here, the litter weight, so the total pounds of lamb weaned by that ewe significantly increases when we have those litters of multiples, whether it's twins or triplets. And so this ewe raising twins here is producing a lot more pounds of lamb for us compared to this ewe that raised a single. That might be a big, pretty, bloomy, fat single lamb, but this ewe here that raised the twins actually produced more pounds of product and more revenue for us. So it really comes down to prolificacy and making sure that those ewes get pregnant. Obviously, they have to be pregnant first, and then hopefully they're pregnant with multiples, give birth to those multiples, and then keep those large litters alive until we can get them weaned and sold. So I encourage you to keep records on each one of these metrics to evaluate areas for improvement. Again, if we don't write it down, it didn't happen. Our memory is only so good. So I encourage you to for each one of these 4 different metrics, determine what those are for your flock and keep records year to year, lambing season to lambing season, and see, are you improving? Are you kind of maintaining status quo? Hopefully you're not going backwards. But if we don't keep those records, then we don't know. And reproduction really starts with the rams or the bucks. It starts with the males. It takes 2 to tango. And if the males don't do their job, then really nothing else works in the system. We need to make sure those rams are healthy, that they're fertile, that they're going to be functional and ready to go to work when the breeding season starts, so that we can get those ewes or does pregnant, and have that whole system work as it should. And we can, generate those large litter sizes and produce that product that we're trying to generate for our operations. And so how do we control our entire management system? And this is really kind of a broad question, and maybe a question we should have posed at the very start of this webinar series. I think it's kind of one of those overarching questions when we think about management of livestock systems. And so when we think about this, really, we can control our entire system by taking the male away from the females. If we have a defined breeding season, if that male is only with the females for a certain period of time, that in turn means we have a defined lambing or kidding season. The day we take that ram away from the ewes, we set a date on the calendar when lambing has to stop. And by having a defined start and an end to the lambing or kidding season, that allows us to control all other parts of our operation, whether it be our nutrition program, our health management program, our genetics. If we just leave the ram out there year round, we have no idea when animals are due. We have no idea when we should start late gestation nutrition. We have no idea when we should vaccinate. Nothing really works. We have no control. But if we take the male away from the females, if we define that breeding season, that allows us to then say, lambing is going to start February 1st. Well, then January 1st, I need to start late gestation nutrition. I need to vaccinate my ewes. It allows you to set up that management timeline and then implement those nutrition and health management practices to make sure that our animals are cared for and ready for that next stage of production. So with that, we'll start, with this little timeline here where we, let's just say hypothetically, we're going to introduce the males at the time point denoted here. And what we're really going to focus on in this talk is that time period, 30 to 45 days, a month to month and a half before we introduce those males. So when we think about, 30 to 45 days before, we think about pre-breeding management. What do we need to do to prepare so that those rams are ready to go to work at the start of the breeding season, so that our females are ready, that they're cycling, and they're going to be ready to be bred when we want that breeding season to start. And so I've got a variety of different practices listed here, and we'll go into each one of those in a bit more detail. And then we can also think about a practice called flushing, and I'm going to talk about this also in more detail. That's going to start about 2 to 3 weeks before we introduce those males. So for the sake of this talk, we're going to focus really on this time period, and then we'll turn things over to Dr. Poole here in just a few minutes, and he'll continue on with that time period right around, the actual start of breeding season and the breeding season itself. And so really it starts with breeding soundness exams. And this is one of the most cost-effective investments that you can make in your operations. You think about what bang for your buck, breeding soundness exam is relatively inexpensive, and it can make a huge difference in the productivity of your flock or herd, and the potential productivity and revenue potential on down the line. If you have a ram that maybe is infertile, you have no idea, and you plan your breeding season to start September 1st, and you're counting on lambs being born, late January, early February, and that ram's not fertile, you may go 1, 2, 3 heat cycles before you realize you have a problem. And then by the time you go and find a replacement, it could easily be mid-October before you get a replacement lined up, mid-October, early November. And now you're talking about, March, April lambs. And so if you were counting on maybe selling to one of those ethnic markets, one of those holidays that has a very defined date, you may be 2 months late. And that all could have been corrected if you had just done a breeding soundness exam 30 to 45 days before the breeding season started, determined that that ram maybe was infertile or subfertile, went out and found a replacement before the breeding season even was intended to start. And so really encourage you to get these done on your male animals. You don't want to do it the day the breeding season begins. You again want to do this a month to a month and a half beforehand. You want to give yourself time to find a replacement should that ram or buck not pass the breeding soundness exam. During the breeding soundness exam, they're going to evaluate both anatomically as well as semen evaluation. They're going to look at testicular development, any scrotal abnormalities such as hernias or infections. We're going to actually evaluate the semen as well. How much is there? What's the concentration, motility, and morphology of the sperm? Make sure that there's a sufficient amount there, concentration there, and that it's going to be functional and that we have the best chance possible to get those females pregnant. So a vet's going to do this procedure, and I encourage you, plan ahead, get it lined up, get it on the calendar well in advance of the start of the breeding season. Oftentimes during the breeding soundness exam or around that same time period, we need to evaluate their feet. We need to check for any signs of foot scald or foot rot. These diseases can have significant impacts on the mobility of the animals, their soundness, and obviously that's going to decrease reproductive success. If they're not sound, if they're walking around on their knees because their feet hurt, obviously they're not going to probably get a whole lot of ewes pregnant. In the same way, our females, if they're walking around on their knees, they're probably not going to get pregnant either. And so this is not a disease that cures itself overnight. We need to plan in advance and make sure we clear this up so that animals are healthy, sound, and functional at the start of the breeding season. Wet environments, really moist soil, increase susceptibility. So be aware of that. We can't control the weather, but just be cognizant if we've had maybe a really wet summer or a really wet fall, there may be a greater occurrence of this. We may need to pay a little bit closer attention to those feet, keep them trimmed more regularly. So trim them, again, 30 to 45 days prior to the start of the breeding season. Allow those animals, those rams especially, adjust to that trimming. Their toes may have been pretty long. You trim those toes back, and they need a little bit of time to adjust to that new footing. It is also going to help in terms of disease prevention. The bacteria that cause foot scald and foot rot are anaerobic. They don't like oxygen. And so if that hoof gets all grown up and over and curled over on itself, that allows a lot of areas where there's not a lot of oxygen and these bacteria can proliferate. If we keep that hoof trimmed as it should, it's opened, it's exposed to the air, we're not going to get that disease development, or it's less likely to occur. And if it does occur, we need to be prepared to treat it. Zinc sulfate is kind of our go-to treatment, especially with sheep. You may use copper sulfate in other species out of concerns with copper. Typically, we side with a zinc sulfate option on our sheep to get them treated. You can do this either on an individual basis, or you can put them in a foot bath and get them treated that way. We're also going to evaluate the body condition score. At the start of the breeding season, the males should be in greater body condition than the females. We want male animals to be in that body condition score 3.5 to a 4 on a 5-point scale at the start of the breeding season. So 1 would be extremely emaciated, 5 would be obese. We want them, above average, 3.5 to a 4 at the start. They're going to be in greater body condition than our females. Our females, we're shooting for that 2.5 to 3 range on them. Males will generally lose body condition during the breeding season. They've kind of got a one-track mind during that time of year. They're focused really on one thing, and that's breeding those ewes or breeding those does. Other things like eating and maintaining themselves are kind of second on the priority list. And so those things may be put aside, and as a result, those animals may lose some weight during the breeding season. So we need to be prepared for that, have them prepared for that. So we need to make sure they have a little bit of extra condition. We certainly do not want them obese, but they need to have a little bit of extra condition so that they're prepared to go to work when the breeding season starts. This may require some supplementation prior to the start of the breeding season. Again, this is not something that you want to assess the day you're turning rams out is not the day you go in body condition score, because at that point it's too late. You can't do anything about it. You need to give yourself 30 to 45 days so that if you realize that those rams or those bucks are a little bit on the thin side, you have a month to a month and a half to add some supplemental nutrition, to add that condition back and have them prepared to go when the breeding season is supposed to start. If you do have some young rams or some thin animals. They can either be hand-mated. I'm pretty sure Dr. Poole is going to talk about that in his section, so I won't go into too much detail there. Or you can turn out those animals just maybe for part of the day. You can turn them out just at night. So you could turn them out, when you do evening chores, turn the males out. They'll breed females all night. In the morning when you do chores, bring them inside, maybe put them in a separate pen. That allows them time to get away from those females. They kind of can relax. You can maybe give them some supplemental feed. You can keep them cool inside, minimize heat stress. Just let those rams relax, kind of cool off during the day. And then, evening time, turn them back out. And really by doing that, we don't see a whole lot of difference in conception rates. Just breeding maybe 12 or 16 hours out of the day, 18 hours out of the day, versus having them out all day long. So they can still get, most of those females pregnant by just turning them out at night there. So that would be one option if you have some young or thin animals that you needed to, give a little bit of extra care to. So we can check for parasites as well. You certainly don't want to both on the male and female side. You don't want parasitize or minimize parasitism during the breeding season. This is also something you can't necessarily fix overnight. And so we need to prepare in advance. So I encourage you at the same time point, you're doing a breeding soundness exam, you're trimming feet, you're checking body condition, do a FOMACHA score, assess that mucous membrane color, determine if they're a little bit anemic or not. You can do a fecal egg count, determine, what level of infection they might have. Look at, any fecal soiling or a DAG score. That might be a sign of maybe a disease like coccidiosis. Just evaluate those points where we look for parasitism and see do those animals need treatment? Do they not? If they're super parasitized, are they even worth breeding? Maybe that's an animal that we should just cull and remove from the flock anyway. That's a great time to determine that before you go through all the effort to try to get her bred. And you don't want a male that's full of worms. Are those genetics worth propagating? And if you decide that they are, we want to minimize the amount of parasitism he has when you expect him to go to work and get those females bred. So another important component to check for there month and a half before. In terms of vaccinations, obviously this would be, a little bit more geared towards the female side of things in terms of preventing abortions in those females during gestation. Campylobacter and chlamydia are two biggest causes of abortions. And so these bacteria are typically transferred in feed or water or in our fetal membranes. If you have an aborted fetus and another ewe comes up and licks on that fetus, she's then infected and she may abort herself. The incubation period does differ between Campylobacter and chlamydia. Campylobacter is relatively short, 14 days. So if you have one ewe abort and another ewe is not due for another month, she may abort 2 weeks before her due date. If she were to lick maybe that aborted fetus and get infected herself. Chlamydia is a little bit longer, 60 to 90 days. So here, especially if they're infected later on in gestation, they may carry those fetuses to full term, but those lambs or kids may be born pretty weak. So she's infected, but the incubation period is so long, she didn't actually abort. So if you're having a bunch of really weak lambs and kids, that might be something to look into. So we vaccinate prior to the breeding season. You want them vaccinated before the breeding season starts. It's very similar to our other vaccines like CDT. We're going to vaccinate. It takes an initial vaccine, a booster shot, and then an annual booster after that. So 2 initial shots and then an annual booster every year before the breeding season to make sure they're vaccinated for these abortion diseases. And then we can introduce our teaser rams or bucks. And I think Dr. Poole is going to touch on this as well, so I won't spend too much time here. But we can use the ram effect or the buck effect, sometimes just called the male effect, to induce cycling in our Estrus, our non-cycling females. And so this is going to increase our chance of reproductive success, especially out of season. Females, so we introduce if a foreign male, not used to those females, females haven't been around a male for a while, we introduce that male because of his pheromones. It's going to induce those females to start cycling. They typically have a silent heat about 3 to 4 days after male introduction, and then a normal heat 18 to 26 days later. So I generally recommend introduce that teaser buck or teaser ram about 30 days before the breeding season starts. And so this could be a vasectomized ram that maintains that libido but lacks actual breeding capacity. Or you could use an intact ram and just use a teaser harness. I've got a picture here of that scenario. You can put one of these teaser harnesses on them, and they're gonna mark those ewes. They're gonna ride them just like they're trying to breed them, but they physically can't. These harnesses make me a little bit nervous, so I'm often hesitant to use them. But I realize not everyone has access to a teaser ram, and so this is the next best option. The surgery to make a vasectomized ram is not extremely expensive. So if you have that option, if you can do that, it may be a valuable resource to invest in and have that teaser around to use for this ram effect. My slide's going to advance. Let's see here. Technical difficulties. Let's see here. So I apologize here. So I can, actually, you might be able to see here. If my screen's still being shared, and you can look over here on the side. Again, I apologize. Let me do this for you. I might even be able to zoom in here. There we go. We'll make the best what we can here. So the last slide here I was going to talk about is that flushing practice. So we're going to increase the plane of nutrition prior to and during the beginning of the breeding season to improve ovulation rate. So if we increase the amount of energy being supplied to those animals as we enter the breeding season, their bodies are going to tell them, look, I'm in a good nutritional state. I'm healthy, ready to go. That's going to increase their ovulation rate. Consequently, we're going to have a higher lambing or kidding percentage. So we want to start this supplemental feeding about 2 to 3 weeks prior to the start of the breeding season and continue it for about 2 to 3 weeks after the start of the breeding season. So through about the first heat cycle. Like I said, it's really driven by energy. So we want feeds that are high in TDN, high in energy. And so that would be, whole corn works really well. A lot of people flush with whole corn. It's a great energy source. It's relatively inexpensive, works really well. If you're more of a forage-based operation, you could also use a really high quality forage. So maybe you designate a pasture, you make sure that it's in really good condition, really high quality, and that's the pasture you turn those animals out into 2 to 3 weeks before the breeding season starts to get them that high quality nutrition that they need to induce this flushing. So when we're talking about grain feeding, I typically recommend a ½ pound to a pound per head per day, depending on how big your sheep or goats are. And it's best to start with those females in a body condition score 2.5 to 3. You want them a little bit thinner than average. You don't want them emaciated. You do not want them fat. You want them just a little bit thinner than average. You want them to be gaining body weight as we enter the breeding season. Starting about 2 to 3 weeks before, through the introduction of the males and through that first heat cycle or so, you want them gaining weight through that entire time period. And you're going to get the best effect from flushing by doing that. So, fat ewe is you give her more to eat and she's already fat. She doesn't really care. So you need them just a little bit thinner than average. So again, I apologize for the technical difficulties there. I'll go ahead and stop sharing and we'll turn the floor over to Dr. Poole.
Thank you, Dr. Weaver. Go ahead and share my slide here. In the interest of maintaining connectivity, I'm going to keep my camera off until the end. Okay, hopefully everybody can see my title slide here. And what I'm going to do is go through some options that we have, discuss the Estrus synchronization plan and what some of our breeding options are during this process. And before we do that, though, one of the things that we need to think about in general is what is Estrus synchronization. And so with our flock or our herd, we want to bring groups of females to show sexual receptivity, heat, or estrus at the same period of time. And our reasoning for this is these animals are going to be displaying estrus just randomly through either their 16-day cycle, if it's the case of the ewe, or their 21-day cycle, if it's the case of the doe goat. And we can group those animals so that they all can be bred at the same time. And we're basically taking control of that reproductive cycle and using it to our advantage. And so some of the advantages of doing this then is we're able to reduce that overall length of the breeding season. We'll have more confined and defined periods of breeding and subsequently lambing and kidding. What this will ultimately do then is create a more uniform crop of offspring that gives us a much more higher marketability of those animals. We can time specific markets like Dr. Weaver mentioned. And then by controlling that reproductive cycle, we can also have the opportunity to advance some of our herd or flock genetics through using some other reproductive technologies such as artificial insemination or embryo transfer. Now, with these advantages, there are some challenges that we have to overcome. Good record keeping and management skills are a must. We need to, we're going to be controlling that reproductive cycle of those females. And so we need to make sure that we're applying our treatments in order to do that at the right times. Having appropriate facilities will make this much more manageable. Having an area where we can work these animals at as low stress as possible will help encourage and increase our success. Because we are physically manipulating the reproductive cycle of these animals, we are going to have intense periods where we're going to be working these animals or intense labor to ensure that the treatments are provided. And in some cases, we're going to need a little bit higher skilled labor in order to ensure that they're done correctly. So one of the unique things about small ruminants is we have two different seasons. We have the breeding season and we have the non-breeding season. Small ruminants are referred to as seasonally polyestrous, meaning that they're going to display estrus in a given period of time. In the northern hemisphere here, they're going to display it in our fall and through the early spring when the day length is short. And so we have different ways then to manipulate that estrus cycle depending on the amount of light that they're going to be exposed to. And so what I'm going to share with you during some of this is some things that have worked both within the breeding season as well as during that non-breeding season. So we do have a variety of options in order to control that reproductive cycle. Like Dr. Weaver said, we can utilize that male effect or that ram or buck effect. And with this, we have to remove the males for a 60-day period. And when I say remove those males, that's removing the sight, the sound, and the smell of those males. Again, it's pheromones that are going to activate that female cycle. And so we have to have that complete removal in order to have an effective male effect. That is extremely challenging. I do understand that. I'm unable to do that in my own property, but we do know that that period away will help. And as Dr. Weaver mentioned, when we bring those females back in contact with the male, we'll see them display a silent estrus within 3 to 4 days and then display a normal cyclicity. Other options that are out there then are using light therapy. Again, these animals are extremely photosensitive. And so we can control the light that they're exposed to. This is not a very common process because there's a lot of additional expense to maintaining that artificial day length. And we're just not seeing it done in production systems. What we're going to focus on through the rest of this talk is going to be focused more on the hormonal therapies. These are treatments or protocols that are coming about that are having a lot of success in a variety of different producers. And so this is sort of that broader range of possibilities that we can use in order to control the reproductive cycle of these females. And we're doing that through hormonal products that are relatively natural occurring. So we have different products here. We're going to have progestins, prostaglandins, and then chorionic gonadotropin. And so when I say they're naturally occurring, we know that in these females, there is this connection between the brain and the female reproductive tract, specifically the ovary. And so we have naturally occurring hormones such as gonadotropin releasing hormone. Some commercially available products are going to be listed in parentheses underneath these products, so like Factorol or Cisterellin. You may have heard of these products. They are the same reproductive hormone, so they're going to stimulate that ovary. The ovary then in turn is going to produce steroid hormones such as progesterone. One of the most common forms of applying progesterone in female ruminants is using the CEDAR or controlled internal drug releasing device. We also know that there's going to be some hormones that are naturally produced by the uterus. These are our prostaglandins, commercially known as luteolase or estromate or prostamate. These are all going to have an impact on the ovary. The ovary is also going to produce some other hormones such as estrogens that will have a positive effect in repro. However, these estrogen products are not permitted in any food animal, and so they're off the table and scratched out, as you see there. So again, these hormones are going to be naturally occurring within these females, and what we're going to do is we're going to take advantage of what we know about how these hormones regulate reproductive function and utilize it to our advantage. Now, before we discuss these reproductive hormones, I do need to take a minute and state that there are very few products approved for small ruminants. This should be no surprise to most of you listening. So any of the products that we use in regards to estrus synchronization, most are going to be estrus labeled drug use. They can be quite costly. And again, having a valid veterinary client-patient relationship is going to be key in order to plan that purchase of these products and make sure that implementation is going to be effective. The other thing I want to state at this time is I will be showing figures and pictures of some of these products, and that does not denote any endorsement from NC State or myself. They're just ones that are commonly available for producers to use, and so we'll be talking about them because you may recognize these products from other uses you may have with them. So one of probably the most popular form of controlling estrus in our small ruminants is using a progestin-based synchronization program. So progesterone, again, is a naturally occurring hormone that is also known as the hormone of pregnancy. We need a progesterone in order to maintain that pregnancy. And so what progesterone does is it is produced by the corpus luteum, specifically on the ovary, signals to the brain, and it prevents sexual receptivity. It keeps them out of displaying estrus. And that's key when those animals are pregnant. But what it does in the open animal or non-pregnant animal is it resets the animal's cycle. And so while it makes it think that the female is pregnant for a short period of time, once that progesterone is removed, it allows those females then to display estrus. There's a couple different types of products that are out there. Magistral acetate is a feed additive. It's getting more difficult to purchase, and it's not very commonly used because of some of the challenges with ensuring an effective dosage. The one that is more commonly used in many of our ruminant species is that CEDAR. We have a picture of that CEDAR on the top here. It is that Y-shaped structure. Underneath of it is our CEDAR applicator. And in the next slide, I'll show you how we're going to use it. Another type of CEDAR, or excuse me, another type of progestin approach is using a progestin sponge. Again, this is an intervaginal insert. The challenge with these sponges is the specific on withdrawal times and proper application. And so we're not seeing them used quite as much anymore. So if we look at that CEDAR, this is what it looks like. It is a Zoetis product. They are the ones that currently have the patent on it. And so they're the only ones that are making this product. But these intervaginal inserts are relatively easy to use. And again, they block that natural estrus activity in order to prevent that animal from displaying estrus until the CEDAR is removed. And as you can see, we can insert that into the applicator here, When we place it into the female, we're placing it at an upward angle, and that is just to avoid it going into the urethral process. And then we push the cedar applicator in as far to the handle as we can, and then by applying pressure to the applicator, it's going to push the cedar into the female's vaginal vault, and those Y-shaped structures that we saw actually lock into place. Now, to remove the cedar, they have a little white tail on them, and we simply grab that little white tail and we pull it out at a certain time in which we want these animals to display estrus. Another type of hormone that's, again, going to be naturally produced that we have the advantage of using is that of prostaglandin F2 alpha. Now, using prostaglandin F2 alpha alone will only work during the breeding season. Okay, and the mechanism actually specifically targets structures on that ovary that are only found during the breeding season. And so, again, two common products here is Lutelyse and Estrumate. And again, these are an injectable product. The last product that we're going to talk about is chorionic gonadotropin treatment. And what this does is this is the one that is very similar to GnRH, that product that's coming specifically from the brain in that first arrow that I showed. And what this product does is it stimulates the animals to ovulate. Two of the commonly available ones that are used in small ruminants is pregnant mare serum gonadotropin, also known as ECG or equine chorionic gonadotropin, or PG600. PG600 is specifically labeled for swine, but again, we use off-label drug use or extra-label drug use in small ruminants in order to induce ovulation. And so, having these three tools in essentially our tool belt, we're able then to better control the reproductive cycle of these females. So, how are we going to do it? Well, first, we're going to look at a couple examples of inducing estrus or sexual receptivity of females that are in the breeding season. This is going to be the same for ewes and goats. So these programs can be used relatively interchangeably. And so the first one is just simply using a progestin. And for this case, we can insert a cedar, and we're going to leave that cedar in the vagina for 10 to 14 days. We can, so when we remove that cedar after that 10 to 14 days, then we'll see estrus in anywhere from 24 to 36 hours later, as indicated in the diagram down here at the bottom. We can use that in combination with prostaglandin F2 alpha, so we can give a shot of prostaglandin F2 alpha when we pull that cedar out, and those animals will display estrus. Okay. We have a lot of success with just the cedar alone in that breeding season, so that additional shot is not needed. Again, we don't need to stimulate these animals to ovulate with that PG600 because they're already within that estrus season. So again, we have this timing that we want, and I'll discuss how we can breed these animals here in a little bit later. But generally, this program works very well if you're using a natural mating system. You put the cedar in, and then you remove it at 10 days, and the animal will naturally display estrus, and your ram or buck will breed that female. I love these calendar approaches. This is how I think about things when I'm setting up my breeding cycles. And so this is what I would do is I'd plan out when I want those animals bred, and then I work backwards. So if ideally I want them bred on this Friday here, I will insert the cedar then approximately 12 days before, because I know I'm going to remove it at day 10. I've had a lot of success with the day 10 cedar. I've had less success when I wait the full 14 days. And so this 10-day program seems to work very well for a lot of producers. If we don't want to use the cedar approach, the cedar is going to be a little bit more expensive than the injectable approach. As long as we're in the breeding season, we can use the prostaglandin F2 alpha approach. But we have to make sure that these ewes are cycling before we attempt to use this approach. With this, we're going to give 2 injections. We give our first injection on day 0, or we want to start. And then 10 days later, we're going to give a second injection. And then those ewes should come into estrus 24 to 36 hours later. Okay. And again, this will work if the females are displaying estrus cycles already. If we are on the fringes of the breeding season, if we're trying to induce them early, you're going to want to stay away from this protocol unless you're unless you are 100% sure that the animals are displaying estrus. We tend to see higher success rates and higher fertility with the progesterone supplemented program, so incorporating that cedar as opposed to just using this prostaglandin F2 alpha approach, but it is available for us if we need it. Now, one of the things I get a lot of questions about is out of season breeding, and again, why would we want to do that? Well, we see that a lot of producers are still breeding within that estrus or natural breeding season. And therefore, when we look at the percentage of lambs, most of those lambs are going to be born in early spring through the spring season. And then we have a reduction of summer and fall born lambs. And so therefore, the marketability of those fall born lambs is going to be extremely higher because there's few of them out there. So we can accomplish this by breeding in that late spring, early summertime in order to get those fall-born lambs or kids. So when we look at out-of-season breeding, one of the first things we have to recognize is that there are going to be some breeds, and here we just have an example of some sheep breeds that are going to be closer to year-round breeders, are going to be more adaptable to these out-of-season protocols, such as the Barbados Blackbelly. We get into the center here, the Dorsets, the Rambouillets, and the Polypays. They have a much longer breeding season, and so they're going to be able to breed further into the summer and earlier in the fall than those animals, such as like the Hampshires and the Suffolk, that are going to be strictly seasonal. Those animals are going to have a much more difficult time becoming pregnant in August as opposed to that Dorset breed. And so we have to take this into consideration when we are considering out-of-season breeding and trying to figure out what our expected success rate may be. Now, when we're breeding these females that are not in the estrus season or not in the breeding season, we have to have full control of that reproductive cycle. And what I mean by that is we're going to need a combination of products. We're going to need that progestin. Okay, so we're going to need that cedar insert from typical 7 to 10 day approach. Again, we see better results with the 10-day than we do the 7-day. So leave it in for 10 days. And then we actually need to stimulate those females to ovulate. Again, this is a big difference compared to when these animals are naturally in the breeding season. And so this is where we're going to use that equine chorionic gonadotropin, or PG600. We're going to give an injection of that product at the time the cedar is removed in order to stimulate those females to ovulate. And so if we look at our timeline down here at the bottom, again, we're going to put that cedar in for 10 days. We're going to give that injection, and then those animals should display estrus again 24 to 36 hours later. One of the challenges that we've seen with this protocol, with this 10-day protocol, and then giving that PG600, is that these females sometimes will develop antibodies and become unresponsive to that PG600. Okay, so this is if they become unresponsive to it, then those females are not going to be able to breed out of season as we would hope, because they're not going to ovulate following that cedar removal. Again, looking at a calendar format here, again, we're going to leave that cedar in during our green period here for those 10 days, and we're going to administer that PG600 either the day before or at the time of cedar removal, and then we can breed those animals. We can have be bred by a lamb, or if we want to use any other reproductive technology such as artificial insemination. So to summarize estrus synchronization, I know I went over it fairly broadly, but the hormonal manipulation does seem to work on a variety of farms with a variety of producers. So that is the one that's gaining a lot of interest. It does give us the ability to focus our breeding and lambing periods and provide that more uniform uh, crop of offspring. We do have multiple methods that are available. We do need to evaluate what our farm needs are. Is this something that's going to be beneficial to you? Are we going to increase the marketability of our offspring by having these animals that are born at the same time? And is that going to offset the cost that we would see with buying these exogenous hormones? We need to have that good record keeping and management skills and technical skills in order to apply these. And then we also have the ability to combine this estrus synchronization with other breeding options, such as artificial insemination or natural breeding. So when it comes to breeding, some of the most common breeding options that we're seeing is first one, which I refer to as just natural mating or pasture breeding. This works very well for most producers, and we can combine this with or without estrus synchronization. And so in this scenario, we're going to have the ram or the buck doing the estrus detection, so we don't have to worry about that. One of the challenges that we do have if these animals are not synchronized is we have limited control when these females are going to be bred. Ideally, to control our breeding season, we're going to let these females be exposed for 2 estrus cycles, so 32 days in the ewe, and 42 days in, or excuse me, 32 and 42 in the case of the goat. And as long as we're using a marking harness or some way to know which females the rams mark, we can estimate the approximate pregnancy rate by just simply observing which ewes are no longer being remarked. Now, one of the things that we have to keep in mind when we're doing this pasture type of breeding is that male to female ratio. We want to make sure that we have that breeding soundness exam done prior to the breeding season. If not, this male to female ratio doesn't mean a thing if that male is shooting blanks. So if we have a mature buck, and this buck is going to be 2.5 to 3 years of age and older, then we know that male can handle up to 45 females during that breeding season. So he's going to be producing enough sperm cells and have that sperm reserve in order to inseminate and impregnate those females. Now, if we have a yearling, a ram lamb, or a buck kid, he doesn't quite have that capacity for sperm production that the mature ram or buck is going to have. And so we're going to put him with a smaller number of females with a ratio closer to 1 male to 25 females. Now, both of these examples are in unsynchronized females. If we take advantage of the reproductive technology and synchronize the estrus in the females, we're going to have many females displaying estrus in a given or small window of time. Again, that 24 to 36 hour window. And so if we're going to breed a group of synchronized females, we're going to want to use a mature and experienced male, and we do need to lower that male to female ratio. It should be closer to 1 to 10 or 1 to 15 in order to meet that demand, that high demand period. That male is we're asking a lot of that male to breed all those females within that small window of time. He's physically going to be strained, and then also his sperm reserves are going to be strained during that period of time. And so those are some things we need to keep in mind if we're in a pasture mating situation. Another form of natural mating is that of hand mating, and this is where we keep that ram or buck separate from the females. And when we observe these females in estrus, we take the female to that male. This again allows us a little bit more flexibility with that situation. We do have to have a way to determine which females are in estrus, or we put the male in for a limited period of time, like Dr. Weaver mentioned. We do observe that breeding, and so we are able to record those precise breeding dates, but it does take a lot more time, both in the estrus detection side as well as managing those two populations and physically moving either the ewes to the ram or the ram to the ewes, or vice versa. So one of the things that is quickly becoming more popular is that the use of artificial insemination. It is growing in popularity, and it gives us the ability to select what I'll refer to as superior sires or bloodlines that are not necessarily local to our area or somewhat challenging to get a hold of. It does give us a way to manage disease in some extent because we are bringing in the sperm cells as bringing into the male. And then in our larger flocks or herds, it allows us to maintain fewer males on site because we're going to be using this technique. Now, one of the big challenges is this is a growing area, the small ruminant industry. And so right now we're in that growth phase. And so what are our criteria for identifying that superior sire? We also have limited options to purchase semen. There are a few companies that are up and running across the country that are investing in this area of research, and they're making a better product day to day. And so that gives us a lot more opportunity. We see an increase in the cost of the procedure. The cost of the semen is going to be relatively higher than that of a natural mating. And then depending on our species, whether it's sheep or goats, we see some difficulties. So in sheep, we're limited on the weight we can artificially inseminate. We have a little bit more flexibility in the goats. But again, we need to observe those females in estrus. And so to do that effectively, we're going to need a vasectomized or a ram with a block on him to prevent him from breeding in order to truly understand which females are going to be in estrus. Now, when we look at artificial insemination in small ruminants, there's four main methods that are out there. Vaginal artificial insemination, where simply the semen is going to be deposited in the interior vagina. This is going to be very similar to that of natural mating. However, we're going to put fewer sperm cells. And if these sperm cells are from a frozen sample, the motility is not going to be equivalent to a natural breeding situation. Cervical, transcervical, and laparoscopic, I'm going to show in these upcoming slides. But when we think about this artificial insemination process, it is going to be all about the timing. We want to make sure that there are sperm cells present in these females at the time the oocytes or the eggs are ready to be fertilized. And so with small ruminants, they're like cattle in this regard, we're going to inseminate after we see estrus, and specifically our timing or our target is that 12-hour window. And so we know what happens in these ruminants is they're going to display those physical signs of estrus, and then ovulation occurs approximately 12 hours later. And so that's the time in which we're going to inseminate those females. So again, we talked about vaginal insemination. Cervical insemination is we try to target the cervical opening. And down here we have various pictures of female reproductive tracts that have been removed. And one of the things I just want you to see, looking at these are all normal, quote unquote, normal cervixes. But you can imagine the challenge it would be in order to try to identify and inseminate within that small cervical opening. We do see reduced pregnancy rates with cervical and vaginal and artificial insemination. Now, one of the things that has been tried, and just like in the cattle industry, is that a transcervical insemination. Okay, we cannot palpate small ruminants the way we can cattle, so this transcervical insemination is much more difficult. We're looking at the reproductive tracts of sheep here, and I use these as an example because sheep, it's almost impossible to perform transcervical artificial insemination because they have a series of annular rings. There's going to be anywhere from 9 to 12 annular rings, which makes it extremely difficult to pass that cervix through to deposit the semen in that uterine body. Now, in goats only have 3 or 4 annular rings, and therefore it is possible. Just a quick little plug, Dr. Weaver and myself actually teach a goat artificial insemination course. If you click on that QR code, it'll send you to the link. And we host this AI school for goats, specifically goats, every summer in June. And registration is now open for our June 2023 AI school, goat AI school. The last approach for artificial insemination that we'll talk about is that of laparoscopic artificial insemination. And this appears to be the most successful form of artificial insemination, at least in sheep. We can also do it in goats as well. And essentially what we're doing with laparoscopic is we're going through the body wall. So we have the body wall, the U here, and we're using a laparoscopic scope in order to visualize that female reproductive tract. And then we use a needle in this other mechanism here in order to inject the sperm cells into the uterine body. Okay. And then this procedure is usually done with a registered technician or a veterinarian. And so just to give you an example of what the procedure looks like, we prepare the area as we do up here in this top, as the animal is sedated and on gurney here, and then we tilt that animal up to allow all the intestines to fall forward with against the rumen. This gives us room to work. This is an image of what the female reproductive tract looks like through the scope. And then as you can see, we have these two beautiful uterine horns here, and we're going to inject the sperm cells into those uterine horns. Now, when we look at our expected outcome, this is an older paper, but I just used it to show that we have a lot of variation right now with the fertility of the semen that's out there. And so if you're interested in this manner, reach out to a trusted source or a company that has invested in this area so that you know that you're buying a quality product, especially if it's a frozen sample. Okay. Just to wrap up this section here, there are a lot of reproductive technologies that are emerging in the small ruminant industry, such as estrus synchronization, artificial insemination, and embryo transfer now it too is increasing. And it gives us the ability to increase the impact of superior genetics and gives us the ability to control our breeding dates to hit those desirable markets. You know, these reproductive technologies do come with some increased risk, increased cost, and increased management. But one of the things that really excites me is I think there's a lot of areas for advancement, especially in the field of small ruminants with these reproductive technologies. And I think there's a lot of future in this area that we're working on figuring out how to best incorporate these products in a variety of different breeds across the small ruminant species. So with that, I will conclude and turn this over back to Brandon, and he can introduce our next speaker.
Well, thank you, Dr. Poole. And so we've already talked about pre-breeding decisions. Now we've talked about breeding. So the next topic we're going to discuss is those just animal selection decisions you're going to make. So I'm going to turn it over to Cameron Meyerly. He's works with Extension up in Pennsylvania. So I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to him.
I'm going to go ahead and try to share my screen here. And just to confirm, you can see the presentation slide.
Yes, sir.
Okay, wanted to make sure it wasn't my notes slide. So I know we're running a little bit over on time, but just a forewarning, I've got a little bit of a throat cough thing going on. So if I end up in a coughing fit, just admire the pictures, I guess. But was asked to talk about ewe lamb selection and kind of optimizing that reproductive performance through that ewe lamb selection. And so some of the things you're going to hear tonight, Andrew's touched on briefly. And instead of just assuming that you've already heard that information, maybe take a minute and think of the importance of it, the fact that, you know, we didn't really discuss what each other was going to talk about, but some of the same topics are reoccurring. So when we're thinking about optimizing that reproductive performance, see if I can advance. There we go. I want you to think that change is inevitable, but progress is optional. And so we know even if we're not selecting, change is going to occur. I'm of the opinion that I would rather have a hand in that and select for more productive individuals. One of the opportunities to do that is through selection of our replacement ewes. And so just some groundwork on what those replacement ewes and the same stands for those of you that are goat producers, are replacement doe kids, but they're individuals selected to maintain or increase flock population. Gives us the opportunity to expand that flock, and we can expand rapidly because we have animals that are replacing themselves and then adding an additional animal in that set of lambs being born. So it offers a unique opportunity to keep the flock's new genetics. And if you've talked to any livestock producer, the hope is that those heifers or those ewe lambs are going to be better than their mothers. And we certainly hope that. The issue is if we're not measuring that performance, we may be keeping bad individuals. And so we have the chance of a negative selection as well. One upside to selecting replacements on farm, two things: biosecurity and then consistency. So if we go for that closed flock approach, all of those reproductive issues or disease issues that Dr. Weaver talked about earlier, we can prevent a lot of that by retaining those females, not bringing a bunch of new animals onto the farm. So the big question is who makes the cut, and I would love to end it at this slide and flash a slide of an equation that says, well, if you've got this and this is who you need to keep. And unfortunately, it's not that simple. The big answer and the extension answer is it depends. We've got an array of ewe lambs in this slide, and I can't tell you just by looking at them who's going to be a long-term contributor to the flock. And so it really depends on the specific needs of your operation. At the end of the day, I'd argue that we're all in the lamb business. I don't really care if you've got, selling wool by the ounce on the side. At the end of the day, we're raising livestock, and regardless of your alternative marketings, we're selling a meat product at some time point. And so the primary focus is going to be in that generating of lamb or that meat product and the efficiencies behind that. So ewe lamb selection, when does it start? This is a picture of lamb sitting in a creep pen. Certainly, I think a lot of those selection decisions occur right here. We see an individual that really stands out. We look at that ear tag and we go back and say, who is she out of, and is that one that's worth keeping? And if I made my selection decision solely off of, say, this picture, this day that I was looking at these individuals, and I am not analyzing this pen of sheep later on in life, I've taken a single time point evaluation, and once I turn these ewes out onto grass, these ewe lambs out onto grass, and this individual looking at the camera, she may not perform to the level of another one in that pen. And if I don't analyze that at that later time point, am I really doing myself any favors in making this single time point selection? So it's really a systematic approach. And I think for it to be a systematic approach, we have to think of the individuals that are in the system for the longest period of time, and that's in our ewe flock. So the big focus in our ewe lamb selection is how can we marry kind of two different avenues at selection. I really like the word functional, and you'll hear that thrown around by a lot of people. And in my opinion, it's this Venn diagram of what overlaps in performance and appearance. And certainly performance to the point that not all production-oriented sheep are ugly, and likewise, not all show sheep that have phenotypic value lack function. And so if we can find that happy medium in whatever avenue we're pursuing, I think we're going to be in a good place. And so when we think about appearance, there's a lot of things that go into that outside of just I want to pull your mind away from the show ring and an individual's opinion of that animal. And so when we're thinking about appearance or phenotypic evaluation, there's a lot of things that contribute to longevity. And so when we have animals that maybe don't have the best udder conformation, it results in health issues long term, foot issues, leg issues. There's a lot of commercial guys that will tell you, well, as long as they can get to the feed bunk, they're okay. And that's true to a degree, and I'll agree with that to a certain level. But in terms of long-term productivity out on pasture, mobility is important. And likewise, mouth structure. Again, we're not evaluating these things in the show ring, at least in a lot of our operations, but the ability to consume forage. Which one of these individuals with mouth structure is going to be able to consume forage and maintain body condition. So those are just considerations we need to take note of. When we think of performance and marrying those two together, what does performance look like? And really that's an on-farm analysis or quality that you need to establish and really think hard about that. So that's why there's question marks at the end of these. I think just generalized approaches at measuring performance, fertility, reproduction, milking ability, growth rate. I think any of those metrics, if you choose to select within them, they will be beneficial to long-term success and long-term profitability. And so ultimately, if you can't measure it, you can't improve it. And I had an argument with a gentleman one time. I don't know if I agree with that. I don't need to write down every sheep. I know if my lamb crop looks better than it did last year. And I hope that's true, but unless we're taking that data and really analyzing it, I don't know that we can say that with a high degree of confidence. So again, not to beat the dead horse here, but record keeping is absolutely crucial. Proper animal identification, both in the mature flock and the lambs. I know our sale barns are getting more stringent on those tags, those scrapey tags being on those lambs. It used to be that you could take lambs in and they wouldn't dock you too hard, and sometimes it was worth their time to put them in for the cost. But have had some individuals that I've worked with that maybe ear notch some ram ears, and when the question comes up, how do you know what weaning performance is? It's like, well, we take the group average, and that's great. At least they're taking some measurement. But at the end of the day, if I can't give that ewe credit for what she's raising, it pulls out all the power for me to go in and to analyze and investigate what ewes are doing their job and then what ewes are just coasting or getting by. And Dr. Weaver touched on it. They cost the same amount to feed 12 months out of the year. So I would rather feed the ones that are actually working and doing their job. So ultimately, when we go to think about selecting replacement ewes, the big thing we need to remember is that reproductive traits are lowly heritable, which means it can take a significant amount of time for us to see significant change. I know there's some producers that might say, well, if it's lowly heritable, how much damage can I do? And I'd argue over the course of 10 years, you can see significant drop. And I'd say also that might make it that more important because it's a slow trait and it's a slow improvement. We have to be purposeful early on in finding individuals that have improved genetics for reproduction and fertility, so that down the road we see that improvement and we can improve overall flock performance. So the value of selection, specifically in our reproductive traits, this is our chance to directly impact our profit potential. We have to have lambs to sell. in order to pay for whatever variety of things we need there on the farm or just to stay in business. And kind of two thoughts between two ideas of optimizing and maximizing. By no means am I saying you need to maximize reproductive function in your ewes and goats. Is that when you think about maximizing reproductive function, what does that look like? There are certain breeds of sheep certainly are litter bearing, and I don't know if that's a sustainable approach to rearing this class of livestock. The big question, once we have optimized the system, what's our efficiency of production? What is that equation? What does it look like? And once we're keeping or tracking that ewe performance, how do we measure and compare ewe to ewe in order to make those ewe lamb selections? And so some examples of that might be return on investment. Maybe a financial term, certainly an ag business term. Residual feed intake, feed efficiency. That would be another metric of efficiency. Average daily gain, certainly a simple one, but a conversion and something that some producers might use to look at. And those are just examples. I don't know that any of those really work for our total flock efficiency metric. And so what do we need to pull out to look at that total flock performance? At the end of the day, when we're looking at efficiency, it's an input-output analysis. So what are we contributing, or the aspects of the human component into the equation, and then what are those ewes generating on the other side? And I've already mentioned that we're all in the meat business and we're all producing lambs. What's your product? Again, emphasize that point. And guess what? You've already seen this equation before. Pounds of lamb wean per ewe exposed. And so we're going to walk through the steps in where this input output comes from, some simple math to kind of tie that home, and then we'll be good for the evening. So there's an order of operations, starting with conception. If we can't get them bred, we can't have lambs. Going into that, we have prolificacy, number of lambs born. That graphic that Andrew started with the litter-bearing animals and litter weight, that's exactly, if you take home anything from tonight, I hope it's that graph. And then on top of that, survivability, and this is huge when we're thinking about ewe lamb selection. Do I want to keep the ewe lambs out of the ewe that I've got to put into the grafting panel every single time? No. Likewise, I don't want to keep the ewe lambs if they live from that ewe that drops those lambs at the middle of the open field and walks inside while it's raining and snowing out. And that's if they live, if I'm there in time to save those lambs. So that is a selectable trait, and we'd like to get on that and certainly call those individuals that aren't doing their job. And then milk production doesn't do us any good if they're prolific and have the number of lambs that we'd like them to and what we've selected them to, if they can't feed them. So those are the main components. And of the four, there's two that tie directly into reproductive function. So I thought I would present this novel concept of you can't sell what you don't have. And by no means is it novel. It's kind of a duh comment. But I think a lot of times we overlook conception rates. Again, this is as simple as not saying you have to go out and take ultrasounds or blood tests, even though that may be beneficial to call those before you put a bunch of stored forage into them over the wintertime. But the biggest issue is going back to record keeping. So come lambing time, those ewes that didn't breed, we'd either like to find a different home for those or make sure that they breed next year instead of keeping them around for 5 years. And so we've got two farms here. Both are operating with 100 ewes, lambing in February. not sure that detail matters, but it's important to have it in there. 150% lamb crop across both flocks. And for the state of North Carolina, I don't know if that's average. I would hope it's at least a benchmark to try to achieve. But in our conception rates, we've got a 5% difference, which doesn't sound like a lot. Certainly, we should be at that 90% conception rate. There's some issues, some health issues that could come across that may have an impact on this. But between the two farms, we see a difference of 8 lambs. And I don't know if that's enough to get you excited, but when we move further into our reproductive concepts, we've got these same 2 farms, and maybe we dealt with some abortion issues the year prior, and now this year, everybody's on the same playing field. So we've got this 90% conception rate across both farms. However, in Farm A, we see an increase of 25% in our lambing percentage. No surprise, we're generating more lambs because our lambing percentage is higher. How much more? 22 lambs. So just a 25% increase in lambing percentage generates significant income difference. Even if those lambs are only worth $100 a piece, it's $2,200 extra for producing better sheep. Now, certainly, it's possible to combine both of those trait areas. And so if we're not able to fix that conception rate and we're having some reproductive conception issues in Farm B, Farm A is still at that 90%, and we're operating with a 25% advantage in our lambing percentage. We end up with that 157 lamb crop. We end up with 127 in this bottom end. This is a difference of 30 lambs. And in my opinion, we're not dealing with a huge number of ewes there. The big question is, what does that do for us long term? From a profitability standpoint, this may be all of the ewe lambs we need out of this group of 30. And it may be our best individuals. We don't know unless we're looking at it. When we're looking at the output portion of that equation, pounds of lamb weaned. Again, this is simple math. This is by no means difficult, but I feel that when you see the numbers, it then incentivizes the time it takes for the record keeping that goes into that ewe lamb selection. Another simple example, we've got UA and UB. Each have had and are raising 2 lambs. We think about weaning weight. These would be our litter weights. So UA is rearing a set of 90-pound twins. Each lamb weighs roughly 45 pounds. So that litter weight is 90 pounds. UB is raising 2 60-pound lambs. So her litter weight would be 120 pounds. It's a difference of 30 pounds. And at $2 a pound, it's $60 per ewe. The big question here is, how many ewes can we have that generate an additional $60 of profitability, of increased profitability or profit margin? For me, I would like to have as many UBs as possible. But that's not to take away from UA. We certainly don't go out and call her right away. We need to compare her to her total performance or total production compared to the other ewes in that flock. And so if we take UA, again, she's got this 45-pound set of twins, multiply that by 2 because there's 2 lambs, we get 90 pounds. And so this is the case that Dr. Weaver had mentioned, the situation with the big single. And we love to see those lambs. They stand out and they look good. This one, UC's got one on her side. He's 65 pounds. It's a difference of 25 pounds. And ultimately, when we multiply that out, UA, though inferior to the other individual rearing those 60-pound lambs that were a set of twins, she still has a $50 advantage over the individuals in the flock raising singles. So those are the type of ewes that we want to identify, preferably UB, to pull our replacement females out of. And this is ewe lamb selection on the simplest form. So certainly there's a lot of other factors that go into this. And this is a crude mathematic example of the impact that reproductive traits have on just operating income. So ewe selection goals. When we're thinking about our mature ewe flock, we need to identify females that work in our operation. And I can't stress that point enough. Certainly when you're looking to source genetics, identify those flocks or herds that are operating in the manner in which you would like to pursue. And that certainly will improve that learning curve. An idealistic goal, and this is, personally, I think I would love to achieve this in my ewe flock. I would really like my ewes to be raising 100% of their body weight in a timely manner. When we think about other livestock species, this is one of the advantage. This is achievable, and this is an advantage we have over our other livestock species or our other protein competitors. So, if I were to summarize, the perfect ewe in one sentence, be a twin-bearing, good mom with ample milk supply that breeds when exposed. And again, nothing novel there. I think we would all like to have sheep that did that. So there's significant selection that needs to occur on the sire side. And again, that was talked about in the first presentation. That ram has the greatest impact, good or bad. And so I'm a fan of identifying or finding out as much as possible about that ram, because you only have so many breeding seasons, so many lambing seasons, and so you need to make them count. So buy the best ram for you, and the best ram is not always the highest seller. I know, some individuals might take this phrase and buy the best ram you can afford, and that insinuates that price is denoting quality, which is not always the case. So to conclude, again, we want to find those functional individuals in our ewe lamb selection, that combination of both appearance and performance. We can't just collect the data and close our eyes and put them out to the pasture and hope they work, because long term we'll run into issues. Record keeping is essential, and that probably needs to be point number one. You're probably tired of hearing it by this point in a lot of these webinars. The biggest thing is, through this record keeping, we would like to evaluate where you're at to identify what needs to change. And that's a personal goal. That's something you can do and something you have to do to figure out what you want to change. And in order to do that, we have to collect some data. Reproductive improvements have compounding results. We talked about in that combined model of conception and prolificacy. If we can improve both aspects of those two items, we see a significant uptick in lamb production, ewe performance, and that's really what we're trying to achieve. So that's all I've got for this evening. And again, just appreciate putting up with the voice and the cough. But I think we'll do some questions now.
Awesome. Thank you, Cameron. I think we're going to go ahead and get the poll posted first. If y'all would, we're going to go ahead and post that same poll from the beginning. So that's about to pop up on your screen. And once it does, we'll go ahead and review the results. And then we'll open the floor for questions.
While the poll's going here, if you have any questions, if you want to type them in the chat, you're welcome to do that. Or if you'd rather unmute yourself, we can do it that way. Whatever you're most comfortable with, if you have some questions. Do we want to start chatting on some of the questions here? Cam, did you see that question in the chat?
On the record keeping.
Yeah.
Yeah, so as simple as pen and paper, is sufficient. If you want to get real fancy and hop into Excel, there's a lot of power in that program. That if you can start there and move off of that, there's certainly some advantages to starting at that point. And it's difficult to find sheep management software. I know Shearwell's got some software out there that interacts with EID tags. That's the individuals that I've talked to that have used it are pleased with it. So that'd be a start.
I mean, there's some like free, I don't know if they're free anymore, like Herd Boss, some of those apps you can download.
Yeah, and I think Herd Boss is like $6 a month, if I remember correctly.
And they each have their pros and cons. A lot of depends what records you're going to keep and what's the easiest one for you to access. Do you have an iPhone or an Android, or what's
Right.
your computer skills? Some are a little bit more user-friendly than others. It looks like we have most of the poll participants. Brandon, should we go ahead and shut down the poll? Oh, I think you're muted.
We're sitting right about 75%. So
Okay.
I'd like to see if we get one or two more completed.
Sounds good.
I did see we have a question in there for what are some good things to look for in terms of a herd sire for the traits? Dan or Cameron, either one of y'all.
Dan, go ahead and start.
So, I guess so one of the things that I think about when I'm looking at traits is what is my end goal? And I think that's going to be the first question you're going to need to ask. If you're working with a crossbred herd or flock, and you're looking for a terminal sire, then you're going to be looking for specific breeds that are going to bring in those muscling traits. If you want to increase your potentially weaning weights, then you're going to be looking for sires that are going to be bringing in some of those more maternal traits. But it's ultimately going to be focused on what your end goal is and what you're breeding for. Are you running a purebred herd or flock? And those are all type of questions. And so without knowing more about your production system, it's really hard to say what exactly to look for. Now, within any sire that you have, you do want to maintain those key things, such as you want to make sure you're doing that breeding soundness exam so that he's going to be fertile. You want to make sure that he does have good libido, he's in good body condition, like Dr. Weaver mentioned.
Yeah, and so if we're carrying on from just that last presentation, I think there's some value if you're purchasing that herd sire, and maybe this is getting too in depth or getting a little crazy with it, but I'd like to see his dam and maybe production records of what his mom has done in that flock. You could certainly find just an exquisite specimen of an animal that mom's raised a single for the last 6 years, and he's going to generate some daughters that do the same, and likewise maybe just some udder confirmation or some of those appearance and phenotypic evaluations that can be done on the dam side of that ram. And then Andrew, if you'd like to talk about NSIP and selectable metrics of EBVs.
Yeah, I mean, if you want to go to the next step with, using some of the genetic tools and our estimated breeding values, we can select for a lot of maternal traits in our male animals. So whether it be prolificacy traits, number born, number weaned, maternal weaning weight, which is our milk metric, we can select for all of those in our male animals using those breeding values. Another trait that I think is valuable is scrotal circumference. Generally, our males that have larger scrotal circumferences, their daughters will enter puberty earlier and be more prolific. So that may, and we do have a breeding value for scrotal circumference as well. So that could be another trait that we may select for in the males that, you know, would hopefully indicate or generate some daughters that are more productive. Any other questions out there? This is out of kind of my curiosity. How many of you are fall lambing? If you just throw it in the chat. Be kind of curious if any of you are fall lambing and
I see one question just came through. How many times should you weigh your lambs?
Well, I think for the most value and just value for the labor even, we'd like to take a weaning weight. So that gives us some pre-weaning growth measurement as well as attributing a large portion of that to the dam. So I feel like there's or that mother. I feel like there's a significant amount of data that can be pulled from that time point. If you'd like to go ahead and weigh another time, it really again depends, as I think all of us have said, on your end market. So a lot of us selling into the ethnic market may not have lambs around at 120 days of age because they've already gone and been slaughtered. So certainly that weaning weight would be crucial, and then possibly a 120-day wait if those animals still are around.
And taking a birth weight is a great place to start. It's pretty easy to do when they're, especially if you're putting them in a jug. Yeah, I agree. I mean, weaning's probably the most important, and then after that, like, you can't weigh them too much, in my opinion. It's just a labor deal at that point. But that weight can tell you a lot. It can tell you if they're starting to get sick. It can tell you about their feed efficiency. You know, if you dump 90 pounds of feed in and that group gained 30 pounds, you know, you can get kind of group feed to gain ratios. You know, if you do that 1 week and the next week or the next month, you have to put 180 pounds of feed in, they still only gain 30 pounds. Yeah, that costs you twice as much to get the same amount of weight gain. You know, is it worth feeding those animals still? You know, just some easy metrics like that might be valuable to you in your operation. So you're not just dumping feed into animals that aren't giving anything back. We could probably have a whole webinar on that topic. There was a question, let's see. Not yet, but when are optimal breeding times then?
For fall lambs.
Yeah,
breeding for
I think
fall
that's what,
lambs.
yeah.
So Amanda, we need to add into that what breed are you working with, and that'll help determine some of that ease of fall breeding, or excuse me, fall lambing. Katahdins and Dorsets and some of those you can breed further into the spring for those fall lambs. For some of the other breeds, we're starting to push the gamut now as we're getting longer day length. And so you're going to be looking at If you're breeding now, you're going to be lambing in August, early September. With those other breeds that are a little bit more not as seasonal or not as restricted by day laying, you can breed them into May and target late October, November lambs, again, depending on what your market is.
Dr. Poole, I think the next question's right in your wheelhouse.
Okay, so with the white Dorpers and wanting the fall lamb, if they were born this past September, they will probably not yet be pubertal. So with the animals being seasonally polyestrous, they need to experience a long day length. And what we tend to see happening with fall-born ewe lambs is they will not reach puberty and start to effectively cycle until the following fall. And so if they're born in this past September of 2022, it's unlikely that they're going to display estrus this spring in order to be bred for fall lambing. And that's just one of the challenges that we have with the small ruminants. You know, if you had a way to determine estrus on those animals to see if they are responding, then that would give you the reassurance that you could go ahead and try to synchronize them for breeding to increase that opportunity of fall lambs. But I would suspect that they're not yet quite pubertal.
Now, what happens if they're pre-pubertal and we go ahead with that synchronization protocol?
So if they're pre-pubertal and so depending on which protocol you are using, you can trick the animal's physiology to some extent. However, you will have a reduction in overall fertility, and you will have overall lower pregnancy rates. And so we can trick it to some extent, but again, the weight and the body condition is going to be a critical factor there. So if they're September lambs and they're on a larger body or a higher body condition score, so they're going to be 3.5 to 4, so they're going to be fleshy enough and of a appropriate weight for the breed, then they will most likely conceive. But as opposed to having normal twins, they may only have a singlet or only be carrying a singlet.
I think there was a question we jumped over. Aaron said, not fall lambing yet, but looking for some good out of season breeding protocols. What might be like one or two kind of go-to easy protocols, tools to use for getting started with falls?
So the one fall breeding protocol that I've seen a lot of success with is using a cedar PG600 protocol. And so with that protocol, and so you put the cedar in for 10 days, and when you remove that cedar, you can either, depending on when you want those animals bred, you give the shot of PG600 the day before the cedar is removed, and they're going to come into estrus a little bit earlier, or you get the PG600 at the time of cedar removal, and they'll come in about 24 hours later. But that PG600 again is going to be necessary in order to stimulate that ovulation cascade that we need. And so that works. That's probably the easiest one to start out with and have the most success. And so that one that's in the slides of the cedar PG600 protocol for out of season breeding. Exposing them to a ram with a really strong libido will help improve your fertility with that situation.
Someone asked about synchronization protocols using a single dose of progesterone injection.
Okay, a single dose, a single injection of progesterone will not be effective in order to reset the body's programming, the physiological programming. So we need a multi-day progesterone approach. One of the things that has been done is a single injection of prostaglandin. So that single injection of lutulized, which may be what they're referring to, because that protocol has been out for some time. And what we see with that is this will work in if the animals are in the breeding season. And so we give a single injection of the prostaglandin F2 alpha, lutulized, estromate, prostamate, one of those components, and we'll see 60 to 65% of the animals respond and come into estrus within 24 to 48 hours. Again, that's if they're in the breeding season. If they're not in the breeding season, that single injection of prostaglandin will not work. But a single injection of progesterone is not a long enough period of suppression in order to induce estrus. That's why our CEDAR programs are 7 to 14 days long. So, Aaron, the cedars are a bit expensive. I do agree with that. Again, depending on where you're at in the world, depends on that cost, and what they cost per a single use. The 2 doses of prostaglandin F2 alpha and followed by a PG600 will work. I think we're mixing up progesterone and prostaglandin, which happens quite frequently. So, but again, 2 injections of prostaglandin or lutulized and then PG600 will work. If you're doing that with the PG600, you're going to be really close to the cost of a cedar, because lutulized in most cases is going to be right around $3 an injection. And I think that PG600, and Andrew and Cam, correct me if I'm wrong, I think it's close to $5 or $6 an injection. I can't recall the PG600. And so you're looking at you're looking at close to $12 for those 3 injections. And I think a cedar is costing right around $7, $7 to $8 per use. I've seen a lot more success with the cedar protocol than using the injectable protocol. But that may be just in our part of the world where we're facing challenges with a little bit of heat and humidity on top of just the day length. So in what type of conception rate? If everything is good, nutrition's good, RAM or semen is good, with that cedar protocol in May, I'm trying to think of specific situations. Actually, we'll be doing that this coming May, essentially with our Dorset flock at the university. I think we'd be looking at given that later breeding in May with a breed that is able to, it has a little bit of flexibility on the breeding season, like a Dorset or a Rambouillet or so forth. I would suspect being in a 40 to 60 conception rate range. If we have a more restricted breed, like one of the black faces, we're going to be down 20% would probably be good in May, in all reality, even off of those type of protocols. We can increase that by incorporating the cedar in the PG600, but I don't know if that additional cost would give you enough boost in your conception rate to offset that cost. So.
Any other questions out there? Will Texel or Suffolk Rams breed out of season? It's a wonderful and loaded question. Cam, you want to take this one?
Yeah, well, I think that question touches on the importance of, having that breeding soundness exam done. Because if you go into that, especially that fall breeding season here in the spring, and you just assume that everything's fertile and you spend the money on the cedars and the PG 600, and then everything works except for the ram, you've got a serious issue. So there's some questions to whether that out of season fertility attributes to some of our breeds, some of our more seasonal breeds of sheep. And so I would just, to be safe, say it's on a case-to-case basis, because I believe there's individuals in both those breeds that will be fertile out of season. And just like, you could have a Dorset that the ewes are breeding out of season and or cycling out of season naturally, and your ram's just not fertile. So it goes back to that kind of pre-breeding management.
Any other final questions out there? Some good questions this evening.
I would like to remind everybody that Dr. Weaver's been uploading these webinars to YouTube. If you search NCSRIP webinar series, you will find those. We'll hopefully get this one uploaded before too long. He just put that link in the chat, so if you'd like to go back and rewatch these going forward, and any of these throughout the webinar series, you can find those there.
The link I posted, you have to scroll about a third of the way down the page and you'll find links to all of our past webinars.
And if you signed up on Eventbrite, I'll send the link to the video back through the Eventbrite reminder emails. So you'll get it on that if you signed up to Eventbrite.
And this is our last webinar in this series. So appreciate all of you that maybe this is your first night on, or maybe that you've been here for all of them. Appreciate everyone joining in, and stay that same link that I posted for where the webinars are going to be housed at. Any upcoming events, hands-on, in-person workshops the announcements will all be posted there. So if you kind of keep an eye on that page for any events later on this year.
And also, I'd go ahead and keep an eye out for a survey we'll be sending out before too long, just to sort of gauge your, if y'all found this beneficial, the entire webinar series, or just this webinar. So just keep an eye out for that. And please, when you get it, fill it out.
Thanks, everybody. Appreciate you joining in.